You were born in a hole in the ground that your mom and dad dug together. It was a well-hidden, sheltered spot, far away from anything that could potentially harm you. This small den became your entire world, warm, quiet, and safe, with no other worries besides the immediate comfort of your mother and the occasional presence of your father. You were part of a litter of 4 pups, all equally blind and deaf, and honestly, not very useful for the first couple of weeks. All you did was sleep and nurse. Your world, at this point, was solely about being cared for. Your mother spent her time looking after you, cleaning you, and protecting you. Your father, on the other hand, kept watch and hunted, ensuring that you all remained safe. All you did was eat, sleep, and occasionally squabble with your siblings over the best spot at the feeding bar. There were no complex interactions or real dangers, just the simple daily routine of growing and surviving in a protected, hidden environment. When you were around 2 weeks old, you began to feel a small shift. It wasn't much, but you could tell something was different. Slowly, you were getting stronger, and your world began to change. Your body was beginning to grow, and your little paws started to stretch and move. Soon, your mother nudged you out of the den. At first, your legs could hardly keep up, and you stumbled over your own paws. But there was something exciting about this new world outside. The sun was brighter, the air fresher, and the ground beneath your paws felt different, as if the world was calling you to explore. You and your siblings tripped over each other as you wandered outside for the first time. Your mother stayed close, always watching and making sure no one wandered too far. When one sibling tried to move too far ahead, she was quick to step in and nudge them back into line, showing her leadership. As you explored, everything was new and intriguing. There was the soft texture of grass, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional buzz of a bug. One sibling pounced on a leaf, another flipped onto their back while trying to scratch an itch, and soon, the bug appeared. It twitched, and that was it. The hunt began. The game was on. You all took turns chasing and swatting at the bug until, eventually, you got a taste of it. Not the best taste, but it was something new, and it brought an excitement you had never known. As you continued exploring, your mother gradually began to guide you all back to the den. At first, there was resistance, but she gave a stern push, and soon, all of you were safely back inside. You collapsed, too tired to do anything else. The excitement of the day had worn you out, but you were one step closer to understanding the world around you. At 6 weeks old, things took another turn. The milk bar was officially closed. Your mother and father began bringing real food to the den. The first time they dropped a mouse in front of you, you and your siblings stared at it, unsure what to do. One of you poked it with a paw, another tried to bite it only to spit it out immediately. It wasn't until one of you figured out which end was edible that chaos erupted. You all scrambled, each trying to get a piece, learning the hard way that food didn't just appear on your doorstep. Sometimes, your mother would tear the food into smaller pieces to make it easier. Other times, she left you to figure it out for yourselves. The first lesson in survival: food doesn't come easy, and if you want your share, you need to act fast. By the end of the week, you stopped treating food like a puzzle and started devouring it as soon as it hit the ground. You were learning how to survive, one meal at a time. At 3 months old, your world became even more challenging, but also far more exciting. This was the time when your parents started to take you along on your first hunting trips. They led the way, and you and your siblings followed closely behind. You weren't there to hunt yet. Your role was to watch, learn, and absorb everything you could. This was when the real lessons began, and you knew it. When you reached the hunting grounds, your mom signaled for you to stop. She crouched low and focused on a squirrel sitting at the base of a tree. You watched her intently, admiring the way she moved. She was like a shadow in the grass, every step calculated and deliberate. Your dad, in the meantime, circled around quietly, slipping through the grass with the grace of a predator. You could feel the tension building, the anticipation in the air as he closed the distance between himself and the squirrel. Then, in an instant, it happened. Your dad leaped forward, aiming directly for the squirrel. The squirrel, quick as ever, bolted toward the tree. But your dad was faster. With a quick and powerful movement, he pinned it to the ground just before it could escape. You could hardly believe your eyes. The speed, the precision, the power. This was what it meant to hunt, and you were witnessing it firsthand. Your mother didn't let you eat yet, though. She stepped forward and gripped the squirrel in her jaws, shaking it just to ensure it was completely still. Once she was sure, she began to break it apart, demonstrating the most efficient way to get to the good bits. You and your siblings watched closely, soaking up every detail. This was Survival 101, and you were learning from the best. The real test came soon after. Mom spotted another squirrel, further ahead, and decided it was time for you and your siblings to try. She positioned you in a good spot, then dropped back, giving you the chance to hunt. You crouched low, mimicking the movements you had seen, trying to remain as quiet as possible. You could hear the distant rustle of the leaves as your sibling behind you made a sound. Too loud. The squirrel bolted up the tree before anyone could get close. Mom didn't seem impressed, but she wasn't about to give up on you. She didn't scold you, didn't abandon the lesson. Instead, she led you to a different spot, giving you a fresh opportunity. By the end of the day, you were exhausted. No prey had been caught, but you had started to understand the process. You were still an apprentice, but every step brought you closer to becoming a hunter. By 6 months old, you had started to feel the growing pains of independence. Life with the family no longer felt as easy as it had when you were younger. The food that Mom and Dad brought back no longer seemed to stretch as far, and the meals you shared with your siblings were becoming more competitive. Hunger had started to show up more often, and the fights over scraps were getting more intense. It wasn't just you, it was happening to everyone. Mom and Dad seemed more tense as well, snapping at you when you got too close during mealtimes. It wasn't personal, it was just survival. The world around the den wasn't as bountiful as it used to be, and with so many mouths to feed, the strain was becoming evident. You could feel the tension rising, and that's when it hit you. You had outgrown the den. You had outgrown the pack, and you had outgrown this small patch of land. It was time to leave. One morning, without making a big deal of it, you simply started walking. You didn't say goodbye, you didn't need to. You just knew it was time to go. You followed trails you had never taken before, leaving the den behind. The first few days on your own were harder than you had expected. No backup, no one to protect you, no siblings to fight with. Hunting solo was an entirely new challenge. You missed more prey than you caught, and the hunger that drove you to leave your family wasn't going away. But you had learned enough by now to know that staying in one place wouldn't help. You kept moving, kept following the wind, sniffing new trails and opportunities. Sometimes you stumbled upon a small meal, like a field mouse or a discarded sandwich, but it was never enough. The hunger gnawed at you, but you kept going. It was just you now, and survival was all that mattered. By the time you were a year old, life had become a series of survival tests. The freedom of independence was no longer as exciting as it had once seemed. Now, it was about figuring out how to keep going despite the constant hunger, the constant risks, and the endless battle to find food. You had learned how to hunt alone, but the prey was getting harder to catch. The easy days of childhood were behind you. Now, you were truly on your own. The first few months of solo life were brutal. You had ventured far from the den, leaving behind the safety and familiarity of your family. At first, the loneliness didn't bother you. You were focused on survival, on keeping your belly full and your body strong. But as the weeks turned into months, the loneliness started to settle in like an old, unwanted companion. It was hard not to miss the pack. At least with them, you had backup, and the food had been easier to find. Now, every day was a struggle. You had found that hunting was easier when you worked with others, but there was no one left to rely on. You could chase a rabbit or a squirrel, but that didn't always guarantee success. Sometimes you missed your target entirely, and other times you just didn't have the energy to keep up the chase. You weren't starving, but you weren't exactly thriving either. You ate what you could, when you could. Sometimes it was a small mouse, other times a stray bird or a snake. The days when you found something bigger, like a deer, were rare, and when you did, the effort it took to bring it down was exhausting. One day, as you were following the scent of something small and edible, you stumbled across an unexpected ally, a badger. Normally, you would have avoided the badger. They weren't known for being friendly, and their claws could do serious damage if they decided to turn on you. But this badger was different. It wasn't interested in you. It was busy digging into the earth, and that's when you saw it. The small animals running out of the holes it was digging. The moment you realized what was happening, everything clicked into place. The badger was flushing out prey, and you could be the one to catch it. You took a cautious step forward, your instincts telling you to be careful, But the badger didn't seem to care. It glanced at you briefly, snorted, and went back to its digging. You kept your distance, waiting for the perfect moment. Then, as a ground squirrel bolted out of the hole, you sprang into action. Your timing was perfect. You pounced, and before the squirrel knew what hit it, you had it in your jaws. The badger watched, a bit less annoyed now, and more accepting of your presence. It didn't chase you off. Instead, it went back to digging, as if to say, well, if you're going to stick around, you might as well help. Over the next few hours, you and the badger formed an unlikely partnership. The badger dug, and you caught the animals trying to escape. It was an efficient system, one that worked. It wasn't a long-term solution, but for the first time in weeks, you had enough to eat. You felt stronger, and more than that, you felt like you weren't entirely alone. Winter arrived sooner than expected. The days grew colder, and the food became even scarcer. You knew that you needed to find a partner, not just for survival, but for companionship. Coyotes. Winter had settled in with a fierce chill, the land now blanketed in snow, and food was harder to come by. The time had come to find a partner. You weren't just looking for company anymore. Survival was becoming a game of numbers. You were becoming weaker, slower, and the energy needed to hunt solo was more than your body could give. You howled into the cold, the sound echoing across the frozen landscape. There was no guarantee that anyone would answer, but you had to try. The wind howled in response, but then, far in the distance, you heard it, a faint reply. Hope flickered within you, and you set off toward the sound. You moved quickly, the snow crunching underfoot, the cold biting at your skin, but you didn't stop. Your focus was sharp. Your body was desperate for the contact of another, someone to share in the struggle of survival. After running for what felt like hours, you saw her. She was just as wary as you were, circling around cautiously, keeping her distance, unsure whether you were a threat or not. You were cautious too. You didn't want to scare her away, not after all this effort. Slowly, you closed the gap, both of you watching each other, your bodies low to the ground. This wasn't a game of dominance or aggression. It was about survival, about forming an alliance to make it through another winter. The first meeting was brief. She watched you, circled you, then darted back into the shadows of the trees. You didn't follow. You understood that this wasn't something that would happen overnight. You had to build trust, slowly, carefully. Over the next few days, your paths crossed again and again. She remained cautious, but each time, she seemed less wary. Eventually, she allowed you close enough to share a meal. It was a deer carcass, half-picked clean, but it was food. You ate side by side, not as enemies, but as two beings trying to survive in a harsh world. From that moment on, the bond between you began to form. You hunted together, moved together, and patrolled the area as one. You were no longer alone, and that, in itself, made a world of difference. Together, you were stronger. The hunger you had felt in the past now seemed a little less unbearable. The cold nights didn't bite as hard when you had someone to share the warmth with. You kept moving together, making sure that neither of you would be left behind. But the world has a way of testing your resolve. One evening, after a long day of hunting and patrolling, you both laid down in a patch of grass, tired but content. That's when the tick appeared, small and unnoticed at first. It crawled onto your leg, latched on, and began its feast. You didn't feel it, not at first. But soon, the itch began, spreading across your back, where the fur began to thin. It didn't seem like much at first, just the occasional scratch. But over time, the patch of skin grew raw, irritated. Your coat, once thick and full, started to thin, revealing the red, inflamed skin beneath. You had mange. It wasn't deadly, not immediately, but it weakened you. The itching became unbearable. Your energy began to drain. You were slower, hungrier, more vulnerable than ever before. It wasn't just the physical toll, it was the psychological one. You knew that you couldn't keep up this pace forever, but you didn't stop. You couldn't. You had learned that survival wasn't about comfort. It was about pushing through, no matter the cost. Your partner, though she didn't abandon you, began to give you more space. She was cautious, as she should be. The disease you had was contagious, and it could spread to her. But she stuck by your side. She didn't leave you to face the harsh winter alone. One day, as you were hunting together, you spotted a deer. It wasn't a huge prize, but it was a meal. You crouched low, moving silently, your partner circling around to flank it. Everything seemed perfect until the shot rang out. The sound of the rifle echoed through the still air. Your partner dropped instantly, crumpling into the snow. You froze, your heart racing. You didn't think. You just ran. The sound of your paws slipping on the snow filled your ears, drowning out everything else. You didn't dare look back. You couldn't. You didn't know if she was dead or alive. You didn't know if there would be another shot, or if the hunter was coming for you next. All that mattered was getting away. You ran until your legs burned, until the air burned your lungs, until you couldn't hear anything but the rush of blood in your ears. You didn't stop. Not until you were far away, far enough that the sound of the gunshot had faded and you couldn't smell her scent anymore. You kept running, kept moving, because that's all you knew how to do. But deep inside, something broke. She was gone, just like that. The world had taken her from you, and now you were alone again. The thought of it filled you with panic. The life you had fought so hard for, the partnership you had built, had been torn away in an instant. You kept moving, but you didn't know where you were going anymore. You didn't know if it mattered. It wasn't long after that, while crossing a road, that you encountered something far worse than a hunter's bullet. The headlights of an approaching car cut through the darkness. You heard the screech of tires as the vehicle swerved to avoid you, but you were too slow, too distracted by your own grief. The car hit you, hard. It wasn't the life you had imagined, nor the death you had expected, but it was the way of the world. For a coyote, death often comes swiftly, from unexpected places. Cars, humans with rifles, disease. The world doesn't stop for anyone. It doesn't care about your struggle or your survival. And so, just like that, your life came to an end. But in the end, you had lived fast. You had fought hard. And despite everything, you had adapted to every challenge. Life as a coyote may have been rough, but there's always another creature out there with it even worse. Trust me, it's wild.